The wind moved strangely that morning, low and circular, as if the forest itself were exhaling something it had been holding in too long. Caleb Harker noticed. He always noticed. From his perch on a rock outcropping above Dead Man's Hollow, he saw how the pines below stood too still, branches rigid like waiting spears. He adjusted the scope on his rifle and scanned the treetops, not for deer or coyotes, but for something else, something he couldn't yet name. He hadn't spoken to another human in 12 days. The only voices he heard came from the forest. The calls of ravens, the rustle of foxes, the occasional shriek that didn't quite belong to any known creature. Caleb logged them all in a battered journal, along with sketches, coordinates, and timings. The forest had rhythms, and lately they'd gone wrong. It had started with the silence. First the squirrels vanished, then the birds, then the elk. A dead wolf had washed up in the stream. Ribs cracked open with surgical precision, organs removed but flesh untouched. Caleb had seen predator kills, and this was not one. No scavengers touched the body for days. He knew the government wouldn't care. The locals blamed wild dogs or the Wendigo, depending on their education. But Caleb had spent years tracking insurgents through Afghan mountains with nothing but intuition and a half-decent scope, and whatever was out there now didn't move like anything born on this planet. He moved downhill at dusk, silent as a falling leaf. Camouflaged in a tattered ghillie suit, he reached a place where the trees grew too evenly, spaced in a perfect grid that nature never uses. He crouched beside a fallen cedar and unzipped his bag slowly. From inside, he retrieved a trail cam, its memory card already full. He popped it into a small reader and played back the last sequence. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then the image shimmered. A ripple of distortion, like heat waves over asphalt, passed through the frame. For one frame, a figure appeared, tall, insect thin, jointed wrong, eyes like onyx stones. And then it was gone. He replayed it 6 times. Same result. The figure moved between frames like it didn't obey the same physics. Caleb's stomach clenched, not from fear, but certainty. Something was camping in his woods. That night, he returned to his cabin and locked every door, not out of paranoia, but procedure. He cleaned his weapons by candlelight and laid traps at key points along his property. Tripwires, flares, spike pits masked by forest litter. Just after midnight, the traps went quiet. Not triggered, dead. Flares didn't launch. Tripwires held tension, but something had bypassed them. Caleb rose and checked the perimeter. In the eastern tree line, he found one of his motion alarms lying disassembled on the ground, circuits split apart with alien delicacy. It hadn't been smashed. It had been studied. He looked up. There, in the upper boughs, something shifted. Not a shadow. Shadows didn't hover. Branches bent under a weight too heavy for raccoons or owls. The moonlight flickered, caught briefly on a skin that wasn't fur or scale or feather, but mirrored membrane. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He stood motionless for 97 seconds, watching. The figure moved between trees without touching the ground. Caleb heard a low hum, like a tuning fork vibrating just beyond hearing. When it was gone, so was the sound. At dawn, he tracked the thing's route. No footprints, but the bark was branded with symbols, geometric and glowing faint blue, as if etched with heat. Caleb snapped photos. He passed a clearing where all the moss had turned gray overnight, curled and brittle. Then he found the body, propped against a tree like a marionette with its strings cut. Male, mid-30s, missing since last month if the face matched the flyer Caleb had seen in town. The man's chest was caved in with precision. His skull had been removed. Not shattered. Asterisk removed asterisk. Clean at the joint, as if unzipped. There was no blood. No insects. A symbol had been carved into the tree above the corpse, an angular spiral, dripping sap. Caleb stepped back. He took no photos. He memorized every line of that symbol instead. He knelt, whispered a name he didn't know, and buried the body with his bare hands. No ceremony, just enough dirt to keep the scavengers away. That night, he lit no fire. He moved gear into a concealed bunker he hadn't used in years. Loaded magazines, sharpened blades, tested EMP bursts. He wrote a note in his journal, They study. They take. They are not ready for what they found. Asterisk, asterisk. By the time the stars came out, Caleb was already in the trees. He knew this terrain in blood and bone. He would watch. He would learn. And when he struck, he would leave a message they would never forget. Caleb waited until the moon was high, and the forest was hollowed out by silence. The pines stood like cathedral columns above him, tall and black against the starlight. He moved without sound, a shadow against other shadows, every breath measured, every step deliberate. The cold night air slid over his skin like a warning. This was no longer Earth as he knew it. It had become a contested place. He carried only what he needed, a compound bow, a fixed-blade knife, and a sidearm silence not for stealth but to buy time between the noise and their response. The rest was in the forest, buried or hung, snares rigged to drop logs from treetops, deadfalls disguised under moss, tripwire that released clouds of powdered glass to scatter their cloaking fields. Every inch of this forest was now a weapon he had prepared. The first one came at dusk, drifting low like smoke through the trees, cloaked in that same shimmering distortion he'd seen on the trail cam. Caleb didn't flinch. He'd positioned himself 30 feet up in an old pine, cradled by a cradle of branches and brush netting. The scout hovered just beneath. Unknowing, it emitted a rhythmic click, almost like sonar, followed by a pulse of light that danced across the underbrush. Caleb had lined that exact patch of earth with crushed quartz. When the light hit it, the reflection scattered, disorienting the thing just long enough. He loosed the arrow. The shaft pierced the creature's neck, if that was its neck, and it fell without grace, limbs flailing in an unnatural spasm. It didn't scream. It vibrated, a strange internal resonance that rattled the pine needles. Then it went still. Caleb descended, slow and alert. He approached the body cautiously. It was tall, its limbs jointed at unfamiliar angles, its skin like oil-slicked glass. A faint luminescence still pulsed from beneath the surface, fading with each second. He prodded it with the knife. No response. He knelt beside it, cutting open what seemed to be a chest cavity. Instead of organs, he found filaments. Fine, silver strands that trembled at the slightest breath. The thing was a hybrid of flesh and machine, but not in any way Caleb understood. It was reconnaissance tech, biomechanical, disposable, a probe in a body. He worked quickly, severing the head and extracting the skull-like casing beneath its faceplate. It wasn't bone, but it held form and weight like one. He washed it in the stream, the phosphorescent blood running in ribbons downstream like a liquid aurora. Then he climbed a low branch tree and hung the skull facing north. Deliberate, visible, a message. He didn't sleep that night. The next encounter was different. 2 scouts this time. They moved faster, side by side, and never touched the ground. Caleb triggered a flashbang rigged to a broken game cam. The explosion lit the trees in stark white. The thing shrieked, not audibly, but inside his head, a pulse of nauseating static that made him stagger. One lunged toward him, too fast to aim. He dove, rolled, came up with a knife. The blade bit deep into the creature's midsection, and he felt it seize in his grip, like the thing was trying to pull the weapon inside itself. He twisted, braced, and drove it upward into where he guessed the spine might be. The second scout came from above, crashing into him with a force that sent both of them tumbling through the underbrush. It had claws this time, adaptations. He lost a knife, but grabbed a handful of pine needles and threw them into its face. The distraction gave him just enough time to draw his sidearm and fire twice. The silencer hissed. The scout jerked once and dropped. He stood, bleeding from a long tear across his ribs. The air tasted metallic. He knew they were learning, watching him just as he watched them. He dragged both bodies to the grove he'd chosen days before, dense trees, little wind. There, he hung their skulls beside the first. 3 in total now, strung like trophies on sinew cords. A warning, a declaration. By the 4th night, they stopped underestimating him. The forest changed again, no longer silent but restless. The scouts stopped moving in isolation. Caleb caught them mimicking animal calls, using sound to draw him into ambushes. He barely escaped one. A plasma net trigger by motion, invisible until it seared the bark beside his face. His left arm had blistered for days. He learned to listen for the hum before it peaked, learned their heat signatures bled out into tree bark for 20 minutes after they passed. He mapped them, tracked them. He stopped being hunted. On the 7th night, he heard them screaming, not from pain. He hadn't touched them, but from fear. One of the scouts stumbled into his perimeter, visibly disoriented, light flickering off its cloaking device like a broken mirror. Caleb didn't kill it. He let it wander. He let the others see it suffer. Psychological warfare. They did it first. He found their camp days later. High in the canopy, suspended by a strand of what looked like spider silk fused with steel. Tech hummed silently in the trees, monitoring equipment, strange biological growths in nutrient pods. One pod was filled with hair. Human hair. Caleb climbed high, planted charges at the anchor points, and set a timed detonation. As it descended, the canopy erupted in fire. The forest lit up like daylight, and the alien screams came loud and layered, a chorus of beings suddenly understanding loss. He sat beneath the wreckage that night, bloodied and burnt, but alive. His traps had held. His forest had become theirs for a while, but he had taken it back. He looked up at the skulls swaying in the wind and smiled, not out of joy but certainty. They were scouts, which meant something worse was coming. The sky cracked open with lightning, but no storm followed. Just silence. Caleb stood beneath the trembling canopy, soaked in sweat and adrenaline. He had moved deeper into the wilderness than ever before, chasing the patterns he'd begun to decipher in the scouts' movements. They weren't fleeing. They were gathering, coordinating, and something about their behavior told him the game had changed. He crouched low in a patch of ferns, scanning the treetops through thermal optics. Flickers of heat traced along the branches. There were 4 of them now. He could feel it, not just see it. They moved with a new purpose, no longer gliding silently, but pushing to the trees with deliberate force. They knew he was here. He didn't retreat. He ran at them. A soundless burst flared above him, one of their sensor pulses. Caleb threw a mirror pane cloth over himself, breaking the heat signature as he dove into a hollow trunk. The pulse passed, briefly disrupting his earpiece with static. When it cleared, he was already setting his next trap, a burst line charge tucked beneath a pile of wet leaves, rigged to a trip line just above ankle height. He moved fast, deliberate, a specter among roots and bark. One scout broke from the others, scanning the undergrowth. Caleb watched through the scope of his rifle, breath slow. He aimed not for the torso, but for the emitter node nestled between the being's shoulder blades. He had learned. He fired once. The bullet pierced flesh and metal. The creature dropped without sound, its limbs locking in unnatural tension. But the others heard. They descended instantly, not with confusion or alarm, but a plan. He ran. Branches whipped his face. The forest blurred as he moved through known escape paths. Routes he'd carved himself into the woods over years. Behind him, the scouts didn't follow blindly. They herded, forced him toward the ravine. He could see it unfolding in their rhythm, and how they cut him off not with speed but inevitability. He threw a concussion grenade behind him and dove left, tumbling into a narrow channel between 2 cliffs. A hiss, then the air exploded in light. The sound shattered his balance, but when he turned, they were paused. Not hurt, waiting. Then he saw the 5th. It was larger than the others, armored in layered plating, not cloaked at all. It stood at the edge of the rise above him, staring down with eyes that pulsed red, not black. The leader, he didn't need confirmation. The body language was enough. They had a hierarchy, and it had just arrived. Caleb scrambled up the slope opposite them, adrenaline burning through the pain in his side. At the summit, he found what he was looking for, the old fire tower. 60 feet of rusted steel and scorched wood, long abandoned by forest rangers, but now fortified with his own touches. Steel cables, perimeter flares, and pressure plates hidden beneath the floorboards. He climbed, fast. The wind picked up, howling through the broken panels like a warning. Below, the scouts hesitated. The leader raised one limb, and the others spread out. He was reading the structure, testing for weakness. Caleb knew they wouldn't attack blindly. They'd analyze, calculate. So he forced their hand. He activated the bait system, a heat beacon strapped with pulsing red strobes, and lobbed it down into the clearing. It thudded once, rolled, and beeped. One scout lunged. The pressure plate snapped. The clearing erupted in a wall of fire. The first scout disintegrated, caught in a ring of thermite and shrapnel. The others scattered, but the leader didn't move. Caleb watched him through the tower's scope. It was reading the flames, not reacting to them. The intelligence behind that stare chilled him more than the wind. Caleb loaded the last of his explosive bolts into the launcher and aimed. The leader still hadn't moved. He fired. The bolt hit the creature's chest and failed to detonate. It had armor, and it was learning fast. The leader raised one arm, and from its wrist unfolded a long, barbed blade, humming with energy. Then it leapt. Caleb barely got a sidearm out before the tower shook under the impact. The leader tore through the hatch and stood on the platform, haloed in smoke and ember. Up close, its face was expressionless but strangely focused, like it had studied human anatomy and knew where to strike. Caleb fired twice. The round sparked off its armor. It lunged. He ducked beneath the blade, grabbed a flare from his belt, and jammed it into a joint beneath the creature's shoulder. It hissed, staggered, then struck again. The blade caught Caleb's thigh, dragging across muscle. He grunted and rolled, drawing a knife from his boot. They collided. Steel and claw met in confined space. Caleb fought with every ounce of technique he remembered from war zones and training halls, not for finesse, but to survive. He jammed the blade into its neck, twisted, yanked. The thing shrieked, this time audibly, and stumbled. He triggered the emergency beacon. It wasn't for rescue. It was for retribution. A final charge, hidden in the tower's main beam, detonated. The blast launched both of them into the air, the platform tearing apart like paper. Caleb hit the forest floor hard. The breath knocked from him. The leader's body slammed into a tree nearby, limbs twitching. Sparks leaked from its chest. Caleb crawled to it, dragged its twitching body upright, and with a last surge of strength, drove his knife through the flickering eye. It stopped moving. For a long time, the forest said nothing. Then the trees began to creak again. The birds returned, cautious and thin-voiced. The wind rose, this time clean. Caleb sat against a stump, exhausted, bleeding, and alive. He looked at the ruined body beside him and knew this wasn't the end. This was a message. And now, someone out there would receive it. Dawn broke without warmth. The sky over the forest glowed dull and overcast, as if the sun was reluctant to look down on what had transpired. Caleb stood alone among the wreckage of the fire tower, his wounded leg stiff and his ribs bound with torn strips of thermal cloth. He hadn't slept. There was no time for that now. The leader was dead. He had burned its body overnight, high in the canopy where its kin had once roost. The skull, blackened and fused at the seams, now hung beside the others, swaying like a grim totem. For in total, a message written in bone and ash. But something about the silence unsettled him. It wasn't peace. It was pause. He moved through the forest with cautious purpose, each step weighed by exhaustion and the instinctive knowledge that the enemy had changed. The scouts were gone. No new movement, no distortions in the trees, no pulses of light. But the forest felt watched. Back at the bunker, he checked his sensors. The air was clearer. The soil samples he'd taken days earlier, once riddled with abnormal isotope readings, were now reverting to baseline. The sky was no longer laced with invisible lattice signals. The immediate threat had withdrawn, but something remained. He found it that afternoon, just past a hollow stream bed where the wolf corpse had first appeared. A structure, submerged beneath an earthen rise, revealed only because the blast in the tower had dislodged part of the forest floor. It was not a ship. It was a relay, a biological node, still pulsing faintly, as if alive. He approached it cautiously. The thing was rooted in the ground, tendrils buried deep, its surface slick and iridescent like wet stone. No interface, no seams. But as he circled it, a slit opened, not mechanical, not natural. An invitation or a trap. Caleb readied his weapon and stepped closer. Inside, the walls pulsed gently, humming in low frequency. The interior wasn't large, barely enough room to stand. In the center hovered a suspended form, not physical, not quite a hologram. It shimmered and shifted with each blink, forming into the outline of a figure, vaguely humanoid, alien, and ancient. A voice followed, not audible in the conventional sense, but heavy in his skull. You killed the Watchers. You ended the trial. Caleb didn't answer. The thing wasn't speaking for conversation. It was transmitting. Earth was not yet ready. They came early. We did not stop them. You did. The message lingered, then faded. The image dissolved, and the node began to pulse faster. He stepped back. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet. Detonation protocol. He ran. Seconds later, the forest lit up behind him in a bloom of cold fire. Blue, not red, soundless, but vast. The node collapsed inward, taking the surrounding earth with it, folding space into something that left no heat, no debris, just absence. He stared at the crater until dusk. Then, slowly, he turned north. He couldn't stay here. The scouts were never the end. They were always a beginning. A test, perhaps, or bait. And by surviving, by fighting back, he had changed something in whatever plan had been written in the stars long before he was born. He gathered what gear remained, strapped the last of the food rations to his pack, and scrawled a single line in the journal he buried near the stream. We were not supposed to see them, but now they've seen us. Then he walked. Beyond the tree-line, civilization waited, still unaware. Cities humming with light and signal. Unaware how close the sky had come opening above them. He would not go back to a quiet life. He would not warn governments who wouldn't believe him, or civilians who could never understand. No, he would prepare. He had studied their movements, their tools, their anatomy, and he had bested them in their own hunt. They would not forget that. The message had been left in their language. Skulls strung between trees, a burning node scorched into nothing, and a man walking out of the wild. Injured, yes, but unbeaten. They would come again. Next time, it would not be scouts. And Caleb Harker would be ready.